Dear shooter, bloodstains left on the sidewalk, body bags, yellow tape. Why don't you think about the consequence you're going to have to face or the families that you're affecting every day? What made you live like this? Is it what you've been through? I'm not talking about in the streets. I'm speaking of the internal pain, the unseen, the pain that creeps. I'm talking about the trauma that stood with you and today triggers and feeds off your emotions. I'm talking about the money you never had until you started flaunting. I'm talking about the power you never felt until you held a gun in your hand. I'm talking about emotionally venting because you believe nobody will understand. Is it self-defense that made you take it so far? Or is it never thinking you would do any harm? Did you black out thinking about all the things you allowed in the past? Or are you not scared to die because you don't realize this too shall pass? Are you tired of fighting and screaming out for attention? Or are you trying to prove a point while no one listens? Are you screaming out for spiritual intervention? Or is it something I'm missing? I'm listening.
Hello and welcome. My name is Danielle Ofri, and I'm editor-in-chief of Bellevue Literary Review, or a literary journal that focuses on creative writing about health, illness, and healing. And welcome to today's event, Can Storytelling Prevent Gun Violence? And we're pleased to co-present this event between BLR and the Northwell Center for Gun Violence Prevention. Joining us today is Dr. Chethan Sathya, Toni Jensen, and Poet Gold. So I'm going to start by asking each of you to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about how you came to this topic. And Toni, we'll start with you.
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much for gathering all of us together. I am a creative writer. I teach at the University of Arkansas and the Institute of American Indian Arts. I'm Metis. I wrote a book called Carrie, a memoir of survival on stolen land. And so the research for that book was both personal, my own lived experience with gun violence in my family and my communities, and also researched the history of gun violence in America, going back to the conquest of taking America from Indigenous people. So that's a little bit about me and my work. My work centers around storytelling that comes from communities that don't always get their voices heard, in particular Metis women and children and other Indigenous communities in the places I've lived in the States.
Oh, thank you so much. Poet Gold, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Bettina Poet Gold Wilkerson, also known as Poet Gold. I'm a former poet laureate for Dutchess County, New York. I'm a teaching artist and an artivist. I use my art, spoken word, to activate people's heart for social justice, help them find their voice for their lives and for the betterment of society as a whole. I also have over a decade of experience in anti-gun violence work through an organization called Sundog Theater out in Staten Island, New York, and also identity work, an Audre Lorde program with the Alice Austin House out in Staten Island. And prior to that, I worked in nonprofit with an alternative violence program, which is a Quaker-based program dealing with anti-violence programs. So this is a passion of mine. I always like to say I'm a Martin Luther King baby, and really believed in alternatives to violence as an approach to making a society better.
Thank you so much. And Chethan, how did you come to this topic?
Well, first of all, let me just say I'm truly inspired by all the work that each of you has done. Storytelling is such a critical component, especially when we think about reframing this discussion with respect to gun violence, not as a political one, but really as a public health issue that we all are affected by. I come at this on a personal level as a pediatric trauma surgeon. I trained in Chicago, and that was really my first kind of purview into gun violence, particularly in children. And I have to say, week after week, having treated little kids with bullet wounds, I come at this really out of necessity. You cannot sit on the sidelines when you see families going through this every day. So I'm very inspired to be here. The power of storytelling is immense. I can tell you the most common question we get from patients is that, not even question or just statement, is that gun violence doesn't affect them, depending on what community they live in. But that's not really true. Gun violence affects us all. And this is something we have to deal with. And storytelling is a critical component to highlight that.
Yeah, and I'll second that. In my day job, I'm a primary care doctor in a city hospital, and I see a lot of the effects of gun violence. Directly, I see the patients as they become adults, those children who still live with the physical and psychological fallout from gun violence, but I also see it from their family members, their community members, and it has an enormous impact. Even things like my patients with diabetes who need exercise but aren't comfortable walking out in their communities when they feel frightened. And it is particularly guns more than anything else. People aren't scared of other things, but guns are really the fearful thing. And we do share the stories, and it may sound a little hokey. Can storytelling prevent gun violence? But in fact, I think we're thinking a bit metaphorically. When we talked about this event, we really thought about how do we bring together the medical side, the public health side, and the storytelling, creative writing, poetry. And I think when it comes to moments or areas of vulnerability, such as violence and gun violence and the medical and psychological fallout, a lot of it overlaps with the same sort of plane of vulnerability from which creativity springs. And I think, Gold, you probably have seen this in the workshops that you do, and maybe you can tell us a bit about that. When people do share their stories, how does that come into the area of gun violence?
Well, the program I'm engaged in, it's over a 6-month period of time. So you really have the opportunity to see a subtle transformation with the students in the process. And I think when I think about the title of our particular program, I started leaning towards how does storytelling, impact gun violence versus does storytelling impact gun violence? And I think programs and conversations like this, begin to plant that seed to have people look at it from a different perspective. I had a student once who walked into the classroom feeling very proud about being a bully. She took ownership of it. I'm a bully, and, smiled. And by the end of the program, she no longer wanted to be in that place. She began to recognize that that's not really how she wanted to make people heal, how she wanted to make people feel, and how she wanted to respond to what may be going on within herself.
It's interesting, and I'm thinking about the poem that we opened up with, Dear Shooter.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was so powerful. And Toni, you're a writer, and when you read that poem, how did it strike you?
It's doing such a good job of bringing everyone into this conversation, of making it clear that gun violence affects the individual, people directly, but that there's a spiraling out effect, right? And I think that's what we're talking about now, that it's a public health issue, it's an interpersonal issue, it's a family issue. And the poem does all of that without being didactic or preachy or, any of the, without having to include a bunch of statistics, which is what we do in essays, of course, most of the time, what I write. So I quite liked how it got all of that across, but in a very poetic and a very lyrical way.
And Chethan, I thought of you when I watched that video of the gun in this block of ice, and I'm wondering how that affected you as a surgeon and a physician when you saw that video.
It was extremely, extremely powerful. I've watched it, I think, 10 times now. And just that process really highlighted to me also, how much time we've been wasting really just talking about this as a political issue, a them versus us issue, when that's actually not really the case. We have conversations every day with gun owners, non-gun owners, folks from Black and brown communities, folks from white communities. And, at the end of the day, a lot of people want actually the same thing. And when you actually start talking about this, there's a lot of commonality there. And yeah, that video to me just highlighted this ticking time bomb. And, it's already started to bomb in many ways, and just how long we've been waiting.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to hear another poem called After Another School Shooting, I Drive the Back Roads of New Hampshire.
Late June, fields greening under a mottled sky. An oriole slashes orange against a shingled Cape Cod. Beyond the stone wall, a peeling wooden shed. 2 dusty lambs pause by an overturned pail. Soon the wild blueberries should ripen. The black-eyed Susans may bloom. Soon apple trees and frost in the hollows. The road silent and long. I stop at the edge of the Sahegan and drop flat stones into the river, litany for the dead. Soon I will turn back, head for home, where waiting for me is laundry to fold, dinner to make, my son to console.
So these poems and this art brings up school shootings, which are amongst the most devastating, certainly as a national community, because they get such high profile news coverage. Of course, there are always shootings happening every single day, but somehow we think of schools as these safe places for our children. We drop them off. We remember being in school and being a safe place. And so shootings somehow seem particularly, something feels like such a violation in our schools. And Toni, maybe you want to lead us off with what you thought with this poem and this artwork.
Yeah, I think parents across America are all in this boat. As a teacher, someone who goes into a university space where we have concealed carry on our campus, this really resonated with me. This is one of the major threads in my book, Carrie, too, about school shootings, both of children and of people considered adults, I guess, but they're someone's children, right? College students and faculty and teachers. And so I quite like in the poem how the birds and other beautiful things are used as grace notes and as balance and as, here is the beauty that we all see every day, but here is also the news that we get every day from every corner of America, and making it so personal, thinking about what it's like to go home and have this conversation with a child. Yeah, I think that the poem encapsulates all of that so very well.
Yeah, I remember when the Newtown shooting occurred, my children were in elementary school, and the newspaper had a front page photo of the children being led out with just such devastated looks on their faces that I turned the newspaper over when they came out for breakfast. And I was so torn as a parent. Do I let them see this? Because of course they'll hear about it. On the other hand, it seemed so unfair to take your child who so far thinks the world is just a safe and innocent place and show them this photograph. So I was both the poem and the artwork really got me. Gold, what was your reaction?
What I really appreciated about this poem, to build off of what the both of you are speaking about, is the processing, that the parent goes through. It's very beautifully written, but the processing was surreal, somewhat dreamlike. You're moving slowly through it to get to the end, that I need to process this for myself as a parent so that I can now process it for my child. And oftentimes in the news sound bites, you don't get that. You get the visceral, you get the anger, you get the disappointment, but you don't get behind the scenes of the process that the parent or the teacher is going through. The shock, the trauma, and how you're sort of waving slowly through this to try to get to the other side. So I thought the writer here captured that really well.
Thanks. How about you, Chethan?
Yeah, I was going to say, I just want to build on what Poet Gold just mentioned. Capturing that experience of parents, teachers, folks who are really at the front lines of some of these shootings is exactly what I took from this. And, as part of my current job, we of course have a lot of conversations with survivors and families who have lost loved ones to gun violence. I had dinner, unfortunately, 5 weeks ago or so or 4 weeks ago with a few Uvalde families. And all I could think about was, I would love to share these pieces of work with them. As that is where the meaning is really going to come. But I agree, Poet Gold. That's what I took from this as a naive, reader myself. It was definitely powerful.
Yeah, and when I looked at the artwork, I was just particularly struck by, and the poem as well, the role of nature and the beauty that is so necessary as we round out the story, because of course the story doesn't end when the violence happens. The story keeps going, and it keeps going for everyone. And I think, Chethan, your point that no one is unaffected, I think these works of art really brought that out, because even when you yourself are not in that immediately, you're still affected, and of course your children and families are. And how do we tell this story to the next generation? Of why we're here. Just and maybe a metaphor, a poem, or a piece of artwork is a way that we can share that story without being so overwhelming, to our children. Next, we're going to hear a nonfiction essay, Calling Card, about someone's recollection of gun violence in their youth. We'll also have the poem After the Loss of My Daughter to Suicide and the image Shot in the Dark.
It was a chilly November afternoon in a southern town so small it never made it to a map. I was in the bedroom typing when I heard the noise, and then my mother's screams. She somehow appeared at the door with her hand over her bloody abdomen and whispered, "Get the doctor. She shot me." I ran past my grandmother, who was sitting on her four-bolster bed with her dead husband's pistol in her grip. I heard a second shot. I recognized the sound of a gun now. I looked over my shoulder toward my grandmother and saw a small red ball spiraling toward me. As I ran for help, clutching my blood-drenched arm, I knew it and I were broken. By nightfall, my grandmother was in a state mental institution. My mother was in a funeral parlor, and I was in a hospital. 50 years later, I crouch when vehicles backfire, close my eyes at sudden bright lights, and avoid fireworks as if they were a deadly contagion. The pebbly penny-sized scar on my arm where the bullet entered is a constant reminder of that day, of that calling card. We were abandoned by our father, our family, and our community. My two younger sisters and I remained in that cavernous 18-room house until they finished high school. We remained a source of perpetual gossip, learning the lonely after effects of gunfire. One sister became a casualty decades later when the rejection and isolation gave her to the drugs that destroyed her body and her mind. Now I am in the 8th decade of my life. I have never touched or held a gun, but it left its calling card at my door again. My husband of 50 years suffered from diseases that affected his motor skills and his intellectual capacity. As a retired college professor, he found these infirmities untenable. He went for his morning walk with his rollator on a beautiful fall New England day. He took out a gift he had received from his brother-in-law 40 years before and put it to his forehead to end his suffering. That day, I learned that you can still breathe even when something takes your breath away, and that your heart still beats even when it is broken. Meeting death through needless loss is akin to having a door slammed in your face. Try as you might to kick down the door, it will remain closed. Death is finite. It leaves behind few who truly grieve and are inconsolable. Many who express grief with one sentence in a card, and those who celebrate it with a passion for evil and a calling card. These deaths left unrelenting voids in my life, and I have never reconciled the losses. Now I am moving along what I perceive to be a slow march to death. Please, God, raise the speed limit and let it be soon. Please let it end unaccompanied by the sound of another calling card. Let this nightmare end in peace.
After the loss of my daughter to suicide. On her desk, there was a handwritten list of guns. There was the cash receipt for the gun. There was the rebate form for the gun. There was the packaging for the gun. On the phone, there was the officer saying, "You can have her personal things, but because it was used in a death, you cannot have the gun."
So those were some very intense story and poems. And I don't know, Gold, do you want to start us off? What did you take from them?
Well, here you have someone who's now in their 80s who experienced the trauma of gun violence in her family as a child. And I think there's a line when she speaks to the flinching of the backfiring of, if I recall, when she hears the vehicle, because it is still so present. And that's what violence does. It just doesn't go away. You can't sort of safely stuff it somewhere. It resurfaces in our lives. And so that's what I took away from this person's poem. It really touched me. It really did. Think that all of these years she's been trying to cope silently with it, but being able to write the story about it is part of the process of healing. It's part of the coping mechanism.
Yeah, absolutely. I think really very much encapsulates about the storytelling part. Chethan, I was wondering what you thought about the poem about suicide. I mean, that's sort of the other side of gun violence that we often don't hear much about or think much about because it's very, I think, hidden in people's personal lives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's why I think, the poems and artistic pieces that we saw here, again, demonstrate that whole spectrum of gun violence. When we talk about gun violence, we're talking about firearm-related homicide, suicide, and unintentional injuries. And suicide continues to be 6 out of 10 gun deaths in this country. So it certainly was a very powerful piece of work for me to read through. I've heard this story from parents before who have felt like they haven't done enough to prevent a suicide. Mm-hmm. The heartbreaking piece is that we know there are interventions that can be undertaken, safe storage, locking up a weapon, that could prevent someone from acting impulsively to actually kill themselves. And just so reading about this and the perspective of this parent was just heartbreaking. You think about your own children. You think about your children going to other people's houses too, and those impulsive behaviors, and how an issue that hopefully we can all come together on. But yeah, the story brings it to life, very much. It's not just a stat, real life.
Toni, in your writings, I think you touch a lot upon both distant violence and suicide and how much they form, unfortunately, a backbone in many communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a good friend who lost his daughter to suicide not long ago, and the anniversaries of it, right, of her birthday, how old she would be, the date of her death, and how it haunts him, that is going to stay with me for a really long time. I mean, obviously it'll stay with him forever, but because it's so new and his daughter's not that different, a year or two older than my daughter, not that different in age and interests and all of it, the access to guns piece is the piece we never want to talk about. And I feel like how that poem ends, the suicide poem ends with, "But they won't give her the gun," is so powerful because, of course, her daughter, the child was able to get the gun. And so I think that it's really hard to weave a critique of policy into a short artistic work. And the poem manages to capture all the emotion and still do that. So, yeah, I think it's really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, we're not really going to get into policy, but Poet, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to speak to what Toni said. You're absolutely right, because as a child, my uncle committed suicide in our home, and I wasn't there at the time. But I grew up in a hunting family. My grandfather hunted, my uncles hunted. We all hunted together, as growing up, and after that, all the guns left the home. It was like, just get rid of the guns because he had access. He knew where to go. It wasn't locked up. We always had shotguns at home. And I often think about how it impacted my father, who's no longer alive, how it impacted my aunt, that side of the family, that that developed some challenges and some issues in their lives. And I sometimes link it back to some of that trauma.
We're not going to talk a lot about policy in this forum, but Chethan, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the idea of gun violence being a public health issue. We all are familiar with public health, epidemics and COVID, but gun violence doesn't seem like a biological thing. Can you just briefly tell us about that?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, think about other public health issues: motor vehicle safety, tobacco use, COVID-19. There's always a vector, there's an agent, there's an environment, and there's a host. You have the same stuff when it comes to gun violence. This is a complex disease, an epidemic that is now the leading killer of kids in this country that needs multifactorial solutions to address, whether you're talking about suicide, homicide, or unintentional injury. Very different solutions for each. I think that's an important point to make here. When I say that gun violence affects us all, it's important to consider that each type of gun violence is very different and has very different solutions. They're not all related just to access. There are a lot of very responsible gun owners in this country. This is really about how do you promote safe behavior. So when it comes to motor vehicle collisions, that started with better data, understanding what works, what doesn't. We don't have any of that data when it comes to gun violence because we've been looking at this as a political issue. Now that we're looking at it as a public health issue, we're researching it more, getting more data, better surveillance. That's what's going to lead to better interventions and policies. This is not political, but having policies like seatbelts worked to make cars safer. We can have similar policies that allow you to own a gun or stop illegal gun trafficking to make our community safer.
Yeah, that's really, really important. And Gold, maybe you could talk a little bit about storytelling in the role of making our world safer, if that's possible.
Well, when I look at this whole issue, I always say the gun is the last thing. When I went to start working about gun violence, the gun is the last thing. We have these little mini implosion. And so I look at storytelling as intervention, giving someone an opportunity to express themselves, especially in an academic environment where there are things that you just don't speak about. But the beautiful thing about programs like this is that you can speak about it. You're encouraged to talk about the things that make you uncomfortable, whether it's, self-harm, whether it is abuse at home, whether it is thoughts of suicide. And storytelling allows one to do that in a safe space, which I think is it's just really important, because when you think about the stories of the shooters, oftentimes the shooters are individuals who felt that they were unheard. They were individuals who felt that they didn't have a voice or they were bullied. But had they been in an environment that perhaps, I'm not saying this is a win-all, but perhaps given the opportunity to be in an environment that fostered the ability to speak about uncomfortable subjects in a storytelling way, in a creative way, in a visual way through art, maybe, just possibly, some of those things would not have happened.
Yeah, and just that, sorry, Poet Gold, one of the issues is that the current focus when it comes to storytelling tends to be on certain types of gun violence, very sensationalized, of course, mass shootings. And these are, of course, horrific, but as you all know, many folks live with gun violence every day, in and out, and those stories are very rarely told. So I think that's also a element of this, is how do you bring out those stories on a daily basis that are never told, which is what you were mentioning.
And actually, Toni, I wouldn't mind if you would expand a little bit on the idea of the story of the shooter, the perpetrator of violence, and the story of the victim. And how do we weigh those? How do we value them? How do we bring them out if we do? I mean, obviously in the news, we sometimes hear the story of the perpetrator much more than the victim, or in different ways. How do you see that?
Yeah, I grew up in a home with many guns and a hunting family, and there were violent men in my family as well. And so this is something who are also wonderful storytellers, some of them, right? Good uncles. And so how do you balance how the overarching narrative of a shooter is someone, we even make it that distant, right? They're not named, it's a shooter. And so, these people come from a place and they have their own stories, and there are neighbors and there are family members and there are coworkers. Whether we want to recognize that or not, is up to us individually, but it hurts us collectively if we don't, I think. So yes, the victim stories are very important, but also the victims, disproportionately know the shooters. And so the interconnectedness of their stories, I feel like, is very important. I wrote about a shooting in my book that happened in Virginia, and I focused on my first person connection with a victim. And then it occurred to me it was a workplace shooting. So then, if I'm connected to her, three separations, I'm four separations then maybe, right, from connected with him, because they worked together, they knew each other well. And we don't want to take that leap. We don't want to make that extra step because it's uncomfortable. But yes, I think it's important for us to sit with some of that discomfort and see those connections.
Right. I mean, one of the thought to consider is, are we all part of that same story? Abraham Verghese, the wonderful physician writer, has written about how doctors and patients, once a patient tells a story, the doctor is part of that story too, whether you like it or not. And once an act of violence occurs, the perpetrator and the victim are really part of the same story, whether you want to be connected or not. And that may be very uncomfortable, especially, as you point out, if they're from the same community or the same family. I don't know, Gold, how do you have people reconcile that you are part of the same story when you share this episode of violence from both ends of it?
That's a good question. It is a process in establishing that connection between the two parties. I know when a student shares a story with me from an experience, then you're part of the process of not necessarily resolving the trauma they've experienced, but maybe providing the tools to have them work through. Sort of when you were speaking about the doctor-patient relationship, as the teaching artist or as the teacher, you're there to provide the tools in order to help them reconcile, in order to help them, where's the outreach now? Where's the access to resources to help you process it? And that's the approach that I take, because it also helps me, I think, as someone walking into the room and thinking, oh my goodness, this person may have actually gone through this. They're telling the story of abuse, or they're telling the story of, walking 2 blocks away from their home to come another way so that they don't have to go through, a gang infested block. They're telling the story of, oh, I saw a friend get shot right here in front of me on this block. And so there's a reciprocal processing that takes place.
Yeah, and I wonder, and maybe Toni, you can comment on this, on the sort of intergenerational story because often these stories of shared violence, go through several generations, and it's kind of a continuing story in many chapters in one big story.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a thing that's handed down, unfortunately, like any other sort of thing in a family, right? Like a set of dishes, like a happy Christmas story. Intergenerational violence is handed down. It's lived in the body. And so gun violence is no different. It often starts, as we all know, statistically speaking, with domestic abuse and escalates into gun violence. And so we really do carry those stories. And the only way I feel to have that cycle be shifted, if not broken entirely, is to speak about it, is to make it. Domestic violence is the thing we don't talk about still that much in this country. And its connections with gun violence we talk about very rarely as well. Mass shootings we will talk about, but the connection with the domestic is secondary or tertiary. And so, yeah, absolutely having that link always be a calm and measured part of the conversation if you're up to it. I feel like that's the work of the book that I wrote. That's part of my life work is being someone who can be in a room and talk about these things.
Chethan, do you see that medically, that these stories kind of get the same way we inherit our propensity for diabetes or hypertension? Do you see these stories that are carried through in generations?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, generational trauma, like everyone's saying, is a real thing, and certainly has many, many downstream effects, just like these stories are demonstrating, whether you're talking about mental health issues down the road, substance use issues, further violence. No, it's the toll of gun violence cannot be understated and does not just affect the person shot or the perpetrator, right? This affects the whole family, the whole community, all of our societies, our teachers, and multiple generations. So no, yeah, we absolutely see that. We see, you know, I've seen people in the same family with multiple injuries. And to Toni's point about domestic violence, I couldn't agree more. When we talk about guns and we talk about domestic violence, we rarely talk about the two, even though, I mean, the number of women that are killed by guns in domestic violence dispute is just through the roof. And so we certainly need to elevate that conversation.
So I want to share a poem now called "Oh, to be a Semi-Automatic Weapon."
Imagine me, fearsome, protected, my skull a clean and empty chamber, not a single thought or care, waiting with complete metallic neutrality for a cartridge. Watch me move through the streets in the arms of whoever loves me, with no fear of who might see. Watch me gorgeous on TV, online, my matte black polymer body splashed across every page and screen, leaving nothing I can do to the imagination. I'd be fucking famous, especially with the men. Imagine the masses of men and boys, pink rising in their mostly white cheeks, standing up from their ergonomic desk chairs and leather sectionals, and from the seats of their six-figure rides, or their trucks, from benches and bus seats. Honestly, it matters little where they come from when you know in your bones they're coming. Rabid, with fire in their eyes, ready to take to the streets to fight for me at last. Oh, to have just one eye trained on the carnage, to feel nothing, to be the kind of property they care about, to have not a thing inside you to push out screaming into the burning world, but bullet after golden bullet. Oh, my steaming muzzle, my hairpin trigger, to live forever and as blamelessly in the quiet as in the blast.
So this is quite an interesting poem. Gold, maybe you want to take a stab at it first. What did you take from that poem?
It immediately associated for me a poem by the hip hop artist Nas. Nas has this poem that speaks to the power of the gun. He speaks to it in the first person, and tells the story of power and the choices one has. And this poem reminded me of that, you know, particularly with youth violence. Youth violence is just off the charts in a lot of community because access to guns is really at a crazy place right now. And so you know, when I was reading the poem, I felt it was very real. It was very realistic. It spoke to, once again, the power of the gun, but the power of choice. You know, there were some lines in there that said, leaving nothing I can do to the imagination. You know, it starts out speaking about being fearsome, you know, being about protected, my skull, a clean and empty chamber. I mean, it was so very well written. But yeah, and that's what I thought about. I thought it was a really powerful piece, but it really hit home for me for youth violence, because in the city I live in, there's an escalation in youth violence because they have access to the guns. And like most places across the United States, a lot of people are trying to figure out what to do, how to decrease that access, and then how to put in other programs as intervention, you know, to the process.
Yeah. And speaking of imagination, we paired that poem with a number of images that were, you know, used quite a bit of imagination. I mean, Toni, when you read the poem and saw those images, what were you thinking?
I was thinking this seems like a way forward, and not to put too much pressure on the next generation because they already have a lot of pressure on them, but it seems as if artistically they're ready to lead in a lot of ways. I feel like the poem paired with the images makes a powerful statement about violence and guns and personal responsibility and choice, right? The clear emphasis to me was on choice, and that is powerful.
Right. And Chethan, how about you?
Yeah. I mean, you know, if you look at this epidemic, choice is such a critical component of this. If we really keep talking about this issue and supporting one another, educating one another, that's when you're going to make these smart choices. And yes, that certainly came out in that poem. I thought it was beautifully written. I've never seen anything written around gun violence that was written that way.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really, really cool to see. And yeah, very powerful.
Yeah, I thought it brought a different story to the table, one that we don't often talk about. I know we're drawing close to the end. We're going to end with some poetry and images, but I wanted to ask each of you what you're working on now, what do you see in the future? And Toni, what are you writing now or working on?
I'm working on a book about grief, which American grief in particular, and kind of grief industries, and how grief can be a space where families come together, or it can be a space where they get ripped apart, and how a lot of the ways we handle grief or don't seem very in line with the problems we have in broader America. So yeah, and it's funny somehow, this book. There's a lot of humor in it. So I'm making it sound very dark, because it's dark subject matter, but balanced with some of the absurdities of the funeral process, for example, or picking out a casket, and how there's the weight of that is so heavy, but there's always some dark comedy involved as well.
So it sounds like you're probably digging up quite a few stories.
Yes.
For this book.
Yes.
How does that affect you with all these stories in your soul?
It's good to write them down. You can sort of release them, I think, in a way, out into the world for other people. And it was the same when I wrote Carrie. I have an insistence on balance through beauty or humor or language or something. So yeah, I have that as practice now after writing that book. So
got it. Yeah. Thank you. And Gold, what does the future hold for you?
I'm working on a video poem called Apple Pie, and it speaks to gun violence has become as common as the apple pie in America. And so I'm touching upon some issues there. There are parts of it I say that may be a little macabre in the painting of how I paint the words in the poem, but going back to what we were talking about choice, it's leading people to understand that you have the power of choice. And I think that that's what storytelling does. It raises the consciousness to lead you to the power of choice. Because when it's just simply in us and we're not bringing it out into the world out loud, we sort of stifle that understanding that we do have choice. And I do believe in saying things out loud in order to manifest them. So Apple Pie hopefully brings that forward.
All right, thank you. And Chethan, what about you and the Northwell Center for Gun Violence Prevention? What are you guys working on these days?
Our big national efforts really focus on healthcare coalition building. We think that hospitals could do a lot for the community, and very few hospitals actually prioritize gun violence as one of the top causes of death in their communities, and something that they should actually act on. So we're continuing to grow that coalition, very much focused on research as well to figure out that public health approach that I was talking about earlier, supporting our community organizations as well. And then storytelling is a big component of what we do, whether it be op-eds, documentaries around what it's like to not only treat victims of gun violence, but also go into the community, use some of our resources to be able to tell those stories a little bit better. And we're rolling out ad campaigns around safe storage and so on to be able to educate the populace a little bit more around this.
All right, safe storage and safe storytelling. We want them both. We're going to close with a poem price tag and two images called We Will Find a Way and Take My Hand. But I want to thank our guests today, Toni Jensen, Poet Gold, Chethan Sathya. And I so appreciate this conversation and thinking about does or how can storytelling prevent gun violence? And of course, storytelling we define very broadly with poetry and image and film and video. And Bellevue Literary Review will host all of the images and poetry plus more that you've seen on our website, www.blreview.org, and you can see all the works that we feature today. A big thank you to our guests and a huge thank you to all the artists who contributed their work and all the hundreds of artists who submitted their work for us to read. It was really an incredible way, I think, I feel like we kind of dipped a tea bag into the community of hearing people's stories, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you so much.
If every life's a story, then theirs will always be worth more. Mine was drowned out by the water, running like fathers for the door. And if my Sunday morning tunes were the sounds of a life lost, on the streets I played with friends, whatever did my story cost? I guess the price I paid for you to promise them a chance, to leave every mistake I made behind with my pre-written happenstance, was just the story you now tell, only a life of wasted tears. And if you bottled every one, they'd sell quicker than the years. Passed by like sinking ships in rivers filled by my mistakes. I guess a moral floated by, one I didn't mean to create. Created in my wondering, formed by my midnight screams, into my blood-stained rear-view mirror, the hands I killed with wasted dreams. But if I had heard a story to stop the bullet in mid-flight, whatever might have changed, what would my life look like? Would you still use my life as an example not to follow? Would I still have stopped to ponder the fatal questions in the hollows? Could a bullet really cleanse every wound of mine insult from the closed eyes of a mother for every child she has lost? Could a shot or two really mask the blood red ringing in my ears of the baggage I forgot to drown out with my biggest fears? Well, if every life's a story, then I just hope theirs aren't lost. I hope they never stop to wonder, whatever did my story cost?